Hello and welcome to another video from your favorite 12-tone warrior, the Weekend Warrior classic rock keyboardist. Or at least I hope I am your favorite classic rock Weekend Warrior keyboardist. So for this episode, what I want to do is kind of take a sidestep and get into some album talk. I've collected a lot of vinyl over the years, and I'd like to share some of that with you. This basically, it relates to what I talked about a few episodes ago in my gigging, classic rock gigging keyboard series, where I talked about my influences. And I tried to watch a few videos that react to them, two of which I had to cut extremely due to the fact of copyright or something. But whatever, we're not going to do any reactions here. What I want to do is do a kind of sub-series called Album Talk. And in this, I want to be able to relate how I got to where I am, how I became a musician or keyboard player in classic rock cover bands through learning, through listening to vinyl records and then later CDs and the radio and whatever else I could get my hands on all through the years. So where do I begin? What I'd say is I started listening to music in the early 70s, things like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, of course. I started getting into things like Led Zeppelin and Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I started getting into a lot of prog, but also listening to a lot of stuff that was on the radio and listening to my brother's 8-tracks and whatever albums I could get back in the early 70s. So there was a lot of things like Deep Purple, Three Dog Night, Grand Funk Railroad, Todd Rundgren, Robin Trower. I could go on and on. Aerosmith, if I didn't say that already. A lot of music I was being exposed to for the first time around like 73-ish, when my brother and I both got stereo systems for Christmas that year. So going through all of this, I would say I was in my early ambition stage, much more fantasy driven. I had this ambition. I wanted to do this. I wanted to take my keyboard skills from when I learned to play accordion as a child. I took accordion lessons and parlay that into rock, okay, here you do keyboards, you do piano, organ, and synthesizer and other things like that. But where I was back then as a teenager, as 13, 14, 15, etc. years old, it was much more like, it was like a fantasy, much more than something I could ever think about applying to reality. But that began to change right around the time I graduated from high school. So I graduated from high school in the late spring of 78. And yeah, then I was like, I'm going to go to community college, took a part-time job, did whatever I had to do in my life to get my general life in order. But I was also beginning to branch out into going from prog rock into even more obscure prog or art rock, a lot of it British-based. And it was largely because I just wasn't really feeling, other than like a few good albums that year that I think, some friends introduced me to, like the first Van Halen album. And I remember liking Joe Walsh's album that year with that song, Life's Been Good. I mean, there was, Bob Seger's album that year that had, the Stranger in Town album was a big album for me. I remember a lot of good albums that year, but I was wanting to branch out and explore other kinds of music that, like, there must be something else out there. And then this album came out right around the time I graduated called UK. So this is my original vinyl album that I purchased back in 78. And the reason why I got it was because being a Yes fan, I saw that, in some of the rock magazines I would read, like Circus or Cream, they announced the album, and I was interested in it because Bill Bruford was on it. So, and I was a big Yes fan already. So I wanted to check this album out, and I really liked it. I mean, I thought this was the greatest. To me, as I look back on it now, I think that this was probably the best effort to revive or keep progressive rock going in the face of, it dying out, in the face of punk and other disco and whatever else was going on at the time. And because it wasn't, it took you out of this kind of pixie fantasy world of progressive rock, and it was much more modern sounding. In fact, if you look at the credits on here, it probably says it. It says it way at the bottom or somewhere where it would be unreadable if I showed it to you. But it's besides the normal credits of the 4 musicians who are on here: Eddie Jobson on keyboards and violin, John Wetton bass and vocals, the great guitarist Alan Holdsworth, who I was first introduced to also on this album on guitar, and of course Bill Bruford on drums. And so besides that, it also says introducing the Yamaha CS80 polyphonic synthesizer, which was used by Eddie Jobson. And this was a new, very expensive synthesizer from Japan that was introduced on this album, and Eddie Jobson's use of it is just fantastic. Now, I didn't think much of that synthesizer note back in the day. I just loved the album a lot, but that would become something I would take note of later as I was becoming a keyboard player myself. When I first heard this album, and then it started to, because of this album, I started branching out into this British music scene that I eventually learned was supposedly called the Canterbury Scene. So this was sort of like my first introduction to it, but it was through Bill Bruford, who had played with a few of those bands, National Health and 1 or 2 others, before doing this UK album. So when sadly this group broke up, it broke up in half, with Bill Bruford and Alan Holdsworth going one way, and Eddie Jobson and John Wetton keeping UK alive by bringing in Terry Bozzio and doing it as a trio. When that trio did the Danger Money album, that album was a lot more pop based. It was sort of more consolidated on the pop side. It was sort of like the pre-Asia, if you will, in the way that they were doing their sound. It had a more commercial edge. But the other half of this UK band, a year later, put out this album. So that this is called Bruford, One of a Kind. And when I saw this at the store, I had to get it. Because it had Bruford and Holdsworth from the UK band, along with 2 other musicians, Dave Stewart on keyboards and Jeff Berlin on bass. So this is an all-instrumental, much more fusion-y, much more kind of, although I'd say the Bruford sound kind of has its own identity, part of this sound, due to the appearance of Dave Stewart. Here, I'd like to show some of the vinyl here. That these vinyls I have here are in excellent condition. Most of them are mint. Again, this is my copy from '79 that I originally bought. And because of Dave Stewart's influence on this album, it had a more instrumental, fusion-y sound that I later would learn comes largely from his participation and leadership of a band called National Health. And also besides National Health, prior to that band, he was the co-leader of a band called Hatfield in the North, and that's all of that business, those albums, those bands, comes much more directly from the Canterbury scene than the Bruford band does. But I think that the Bruford album, the Bruford band feels to me like the last good faith effort to save that Canterbury sound, that whole distorted organ kind of quasi jazz avant-garde sound that largely started with another band that we're going to get into here in a little bit. So I'm sort of moving along, kind of working my way backwards, a little bit forwards, but also backwards from the moment I heard that UK album. So working my way backwards a little bit from One of a Kind by Bruford, I discovered this album. Now, I used to see this one in stores. This is called Feels Good to Me by Bruford. It's the same band that is on the One of a Kind album. The only difference is this came out in 1977, and then this kind of got shelved. The Bruford band got shelved. He went on to do UK and then came back to the Bruford band after UK dissolved. So in a way, it's like this is the first Bruford band album and One of a Kind is the second one, although it wasn't planned out that way. So in any case, this took me further into it's got some stranger, a little more tougher to get into stuff than is on One of a Kind. So, but the thing that fascinated me about this album, again, vinyl. This is from the Editions EG. That's the vinyl U.S. Release copy. Is that I was fascinated by the fact that the singer, they have a singer on here, a female singer named Annette Peacock. And I believe there she is right. Let me position that there. There she is right there. And she sings a few songs on this album that you would, if you weren't ready for it or weren't into jazz, you would think were just really strange and would ruin this album of otherwise excellent Bruford instrumentals. But I don't think of it that way. I liked those songs with Annette Peacock. I liked her very slinky, sultry, jazzy vocal style. Very nonchalant and with a lot of sexual edge and innuendo. So because I was kind of, besides liking the Bruford band's music, I took a little side route and discovered this album. Due to my quasi fascination with Annette Peacock, I found this album. She put an album out in 1979 called The Perfect Release. Now, she was a jazzer. Her husband, Gary Peacock, was, I believe, a jazz bass player. Back in the 60s, she and her husband, Gary, and then later another jazz bass player, Paul Bley, or a jazz pianist maybe, were putting out albums. And she was very avant-garde at that time, very difficult to get into if you weren't into jazz. But then she put out a few albums starting in the early 70s where she, was making the music a little more accessible, although it was quite strange to the average ear still at that point. Then with her association with Bruford, I think caused her to, hey, I'll take this kind of music, this fusion-y stuff, and run with that. And she put out a few albums in the late 70s. This is one of them. I believe X Dreams came out before this one. on this New York-based label called Tomato Records. And this is my vinyl copy. Again, in stellar condition. All of these albums I'm showing you are playable. And this is my copy from... Now, I got this one maybe a year or two later in the early 80s. I didn't quite get it the year it came out. So, and this, her musicians on this album, she has the great jazz fusion keyboardist Max Middleton on here. And so he gives it that keyboard style that sounds a lot like Jeff Beck's band with either Jan Hammer or Max Middleton, because Max Middleton, he does a lot of Rhodes on here, but he does a lot of those Jan Hammer style Moog leads. So there's, you know, so I really like this album a lot. I like Annette Peacock's style. Not a fan of every kind of album she puts out, but I do like this late 70s period of music that she was doing. So as I was starting to, what happened was right about late 78 into 79, I acquired a rock encyclopedia. It was called, well, the Encyclopedia of Rock, what else? And I had the first edition of it. This later became known a lot more for its second edition that included a lot of 80s musicians. But I believe it was the second edition of it. One came out in 77. The one I got came out in 78. They revised it only by 1 year. But I loved reading through that Encyclopedia of Rock because it was opening my eyes to a lot of... There were a lot of names in there. I've never heard of this band and this band and this band, but I see it's related to Led Zeppelin or Yes or I don't know, whatever of these other bands I'm listening to, say Deep Purple. There's all these members floating around, and then I see these other bands I never heard of. So one band that I read about that fascinated in me because I saw that Canterbury reference again was a band called Soft Machine. And when I read about them in the encyclopedia and then at the store I found this album, Third, I decided to buy it. And it's really one of the best purchases I ever made back in the day, because this really opened my eyes. Well, really the reason, it wasn't so much that I just found it through the encyclopedia, but I read also in the encyclopedia that the name Alan Holdsworth came up, but in these other bands. Like I saw he was in Soft Machine and he was in this band called Gong that I also never heard of. So because I liked Alan Holdsworth so much from UK and Bruford, I decided to try out. I was going to try to find what album Alan Holdsworth was on in Soft Machine, but I didn't know. So I thought, is he on this one? I don't know. No, he isn't. This is a much earlier version of the band than the sort of late 70s fusion-y Soft Machine. But I liked it. At first, it was a little tough to get into. Facelift was very avant-garde, and a lot of the two songs on here are almost straight-ahead jazz, not quite. And one is Robert Wyatt's baby, his piece called The Moon in June, which has vocals. But I liked the album, and I decided to check out more Soft Machine. So going through from Third, and by the way, I do have that one on CD right here. There's my copy of Third on CD, which I picked up later just so I could have a copy for my car. But like back in the 90s, I was picking up a lot of used or new CDs for cheap, or trading vinyl that I had, because I basically had, over the course of my lifetime, about somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 albums, and what I have remaining is about 600 to 650, and that's where I'm picking these albums from. A lot of these albums I might talk about, some of which I no longer have, or I got myself or I traded it late early and then later got myself a CD copy of. I'll let you know that that's the case. And in this case, the Soft Machine's second album, called Soft Machine Volume 2, I did have this originally on vinyl, traded it at some point, and then got it back here. So this one fascinated me even more because really there's a lot more going on, and it's backing up into a little closer to their original psychedelic sound. And I really loved this album. There's the back cover, well, actually the picture of the band on the inside. And this is a different picture of the band than what I had on the vinyl. On the vinyl copy, Robert Wyatt had like a straw hat on. In any case, Volume 2, I got into that. Now, what I want to mention is that as I'm listening to all this music that I've introduced you to so far, I'm reaching a different stage as a music fan evolving into a musician. When I was listening to all this stuff, it boggled my mind that there were musicians this good that either got record contracts and weren't popular, or maybe never. I was thinking, if there's musicians this good who had, some with major, some with not so major labels, but they were putting out records. And there must be other musicians out there too that don't have contracts that sound great and that I'd love to listen to. And it started to make me think I was building up an ambition for wanting to be a musician and seeing a possibility in that, well, if they could do it, can't I do it? Can I form an underground band and work my way up? And, so as I was listening to UK, Bruford, Soft Machine, all these albums, I was getting an ambition for wanting to do it myself. So here's a few more Soft Machine albums that I got back in the very late 70s, early 80s. This is 4. This came out, of course, right after 3, duh. And that one is, they're getting more away from the psychedelic rock era. By the time of this 4th album, they're pretty much a complete jazz fusion band. But not the kind with heavy distorted guitar. They're a guitarless band. This is 5 and 6. Well, I have them as separate ones. I know that there's a CD twofer of this, but this is my copy of 5 that I originally had on vinyl. This is very interesting in that it has one side of it, side A, has the drummer Phil Howard, who replaced Robert Wyatt when he left after 4th. And he's an incredible drummer. Why Mike Ratledge had to drop him, I guess, I don't know, he was too good for the band. But in any case, and then they replaced him with John Marshall for side 2 of this album. By the way, I should mention, since I'm talking about Soft Machine, is, yes, Mike Ratledge, who's right there on the front cover, the guy there with the shades. He died just about almost a month ago, and I saw all the reports on it. So R.I.P. Mike Ratledge. You were a great, innovative musician who was leading this band during this time here. There's my version of Soft Machine 6. Again, I had this on vinyl originally. This is half live and half... It's a double album that came out in 73. It's half live and half studio. Now, this is my copy of Soft Machine 7. And this one is the American Columbia Records pressing. It doesn't have the computer glitchy looking face with all the little squares or whatever. You know that cover, that bluish looking face that looks partially computerized. But in any case, this is now this one they're sort of in that territory they were still in with the sixth album. They're just exploring some very quirky, quasi jazzy music, but that doesn't have any guitar in it. But that would change on the next album, which is called Bundles. Now, my copy of Bundles here, which I got back in the day, like roughly about 1980 or so. Yeah, see, they chopped off the, back in the day when you got records in the sale bin, they might take a little piece out right there, or just chop a corner off a little bit. But here they just took a big, massive corner out of this album. But when I found it at the price I did, and being an import, as you can see by that sticker right there, I grabbed it right away. And this is the album that has the same lineup as 7, but has Alan Holdsworth in it, right? Right there. And so Alan Holdsworth brings a ton of energy to Soft Machine on this album. I mean, his guitar leads on here. Now, this really is, it's not my introduction to Alan Holdsworth, but it kind of is the world's introduction to Alan Holdsworth. And so here I found the treasure I was looking for when I first started buying Soft Machine albums. The one that has Alan Holdsworth on it. I finally got it. And this company here that imports albums, they're called Gem. If you see that sticker right there, they were a company in Plainfield, New Jersey that was responsible for importing a lot of British albums and maybe albums from other countries. And that's how I got my hand on a lot of these imports, because as I read through the Encyclopedia of Rock, a lot of these albums, as I went to pursue them, were not available. They were never printed in the States. And this is one of them that was never printed in the States originally. Back in the day, you had to get it on import. Now, this Gem company will come up again as I have a discussion, because they also had, they sort of either partnered with or created their own label called Passport Records. And now I lived in New Jersey back in the day, and so to me it's like, wow, a company like right near, not far from where I lived, was importing all these records and also establishing their own label, which they could use to print these British albums that were not released on big labels in the U.S., print them here on this U.S. label named Passport. So, sorry for that screed that went on there and got away from the main topic. So, getting more into this jazzy Canterbury stuff, branching off from Bruford, I started getting into the stuff that Dave Stewart, his keyboard player from Bruford, was into prior to Bruford. And this is one of the items. It's called National Health of Cues and Cures. This is National Health's second LP. I had the first one also back in the day, the one called National Health that has Tenemus Roads, one of my favorite Canterbury songs of all time. This is also a very good, this is a good sort of fusion-y Canterbury album that is what National Health did was kind of close to the Bruford sound, except maybe not as polished, and Dave Stewart would still have that distorted organ tone that he kind of got from Mike Ratledge from Soft Machine. And that was still prevalent on here, while in the Bruford band, they sort of had more polished synthy tones. But this is a great album, and it's Dave Stewart on keyboards, Pip Pyle on drums, John Greaves on bass, and who am I missing? Phil Miller on guitar. So again, these names are going to come up in that, okay, who's Phil Miller? Who else was he on? And then that gets into even some of the earlier Dave Stewart stuff, that also that drummer Pit Pyle and that guitarist Phil Miller were on. And it's this band, Hatfield and the North. Now this, to me, as I worked my way backward from Bruford and UK, those albums, through to National Health, now even to earlier albums, like this came out in 73, Hatfield and the North, and then these National Health albums were more like mid to late 70s, and then Bruford was very late 70s into the early 80s. But this, I mean, this even, that whole Canterbury sound, it gets more and more vivid, more and more revelatory, more and more concise. You get more vocals, more whimsical English things. You know, it's just it takes you even further and further into that Canterbury sound. You know, but how it sounded in the early 70s. So that first album, along with their second one called The Rotters Club. Now this one, I put out, I know about 10 to 12 years ago, I put out a video here on my channel, long before I decided to do it, like coming from the perspective of a classic rock keyboard player. I did put out a few Canterbury videos, and I talked about this album. This is my copy from, my original copy of the Rotters Club. And I think that this album is one of the best things to ever come out of the 70s. And a friend of mine, I got that idea from a friend of mine, so I'm saying it again. I agree with him. This album, there's my Virgin Records copy, green on one side, blue, red on the other, mint vinyl. This is even, I think, better than the first one, but not by too much. The first, Hatfield in the North, is very good. This one, I mean, it's amazing, especially the suite of songs called Mumps on side 2. That is just like a triumphant statement of all things jazzy, avant-garde, and Canterbury. It's all here. It's all here. So, the Rotters Club, Hatfield in the North. Now I'm beginning to branch out a little into areas that... So far, I want to emphasize that there's a lot of keyboard work. So far, I think out of all these albums I've shown you, there's nothing there that was outside of this jazzy, fusiony keyboard work. And that's what I was beginning to become attracted to and wanting to learn to play. But also, as I was branching out with my Canterbury, record buying spree back in the late 70s, early 80s, I again it was sort of like both Bill Bruford and Alan Holdsworth acted as these catalysts that got me into other bands and especially Holdsworth, because of all the different bands he'd been in. I discovered Holdsworth again through this band, Gong, or I discovered Gong through Holdsworth. So Holdsworth appears on this album, Gazoos, which this is the original British. This is an import, again, from that company in Plainfield, New Jersey. But in America, this was called Espresso, and it had a different cover, but it was the same music. And then they would go on to create Espresso 2, and by that time it's Pierre Moreland's Gong. But here it isn't really quite, with the album that came out before this, Shamal, and then this album, they're not quite in Pierre Moreland's complete territory yet, but they're getting there. You get that very percussive, chromatic percussion sound, xylophones, marimba, all that business. So Alan Holdsworth's solos on here are amazing, just like they are on Soft Machine Bundles. And then this got me into gong. I started getting in, but that we're not going to get into that for this episode. We're going to save gong talk. Gong gets its own video, just like another band I'm going to mention right now should get its own video. This is more like I'm branching out. I got into gong. I got into David Allen's version of gong, all of it, and collected a ton of vinyl. I also did the same for this band because of their connection to, well, here's the way this worked for me. I got into this band, Camel, prior to getting into another band whose is a real kind of Canterbury band whose name also begins with the letter C, but I won't reveal that yet. But somehow I came across this band in my record searches and discovered that they had some members that did or may not have had Canterbury connections, and I really liked them. Camel. So Camel are a sort of Canterbury related band, and you're very progressive, kind of like Yes and kind of like Genesis a little bit. A little more, no, I wouldn't say commercialized, but their sound, it didn't go out there too much into Pixie land. It was more like tailored for more regular classic rock ears, but it still had a progressive edge to it. So this album now this is an American release that is on this very label I was talking about, Passport Records. So if you look at that right there, let me see if I can get it upright. There we go. See that? Passport Records. And I had a lot of albums that I bought that were on this label, such as albums by, say, Anthony Phillips, former guitarist of Genesis, released albums on this label. I guess the Passport that was being run by the Gem Importer Company, they would print albums for the U.S. market on this label. So that's very cool. So I got a ton of Camel albums as the 80s were moving on. And that led me, of course, the connection with Richard Sinclair in particular led me to this band, Caravan. So I'm working my way back again. This is In the Land of Grey and Pink, which I talked about in a previous video of mine. It's my favorite Caravan album. I think it's their best one, although they have a couple of runners-up that are very close to this. And this is, like Soft Machine, one of the originating Canterbury bands, because they have members in it that actually, this band actually formulated through a band called the Wildflowers right there in Canterbury. And there's the inside of that showing they appear very triumphant, like they know they have a good album on their hands, and I think they did. So I got into Caravan, got just about all of their albums. And then another branching off from Gong was I got into this guitarist who was a member of Gong, who went out on his own after David Allen left the band. This is Steve Hillage. This is my copy of the album Green. I got quite a few more of the Steve Hillage albums. But the thing about this album is ever will be, well, I don't know about ever will be, the only color vinyl, it's not a picture disc, it's a color vinyl disc in green. It's the only color vinyl I have that I have ever had. So very cool. And it's in stellar shape too. So this is an import. This is not a Gem Passport deal. So I got a bunch of Steve Hillage too. So my Canterbury, by like the year, say 83, these years 79 through 83, is when I was moving from being into... Oh, you know what? I should also be showing you more CDs here. Before I get into that, what I was just going to tell you there, I'll show you a few more. These are all Soft Machine items that I got, I got later on. One of the Soft Machine albums that I got back in the day was called Triple Echo. And I'm not sure if this was an American only or a Brit. I think it was an import only because it was on Harvest Records in the UK. Same label that Pink Floyd were on. And Harvest Records put out this triple album called Triple Echo. Now, there was never... What I'm holding here... excuse me. What I'm showing you here is a CD I put together because I had the original vinyl. Excuse me, I have the hiccups. I had the original vinyl of this, and it's a collection of all kinds of rarities from the Soft Machine period, 66 to 76. I had it on vinyl. At some point, I had to sell it. I needed the money, but I got a shit ton of money for it. But before I sold it, I made it myself a CD copy of it. I basically burned it to CD, and I built this, personal copy for myself. Made these stickers for the CDs. I made my own booklet just so I would have this because I didn't want to lose the music. But I did have this on vinyl. A very rare Soft Machine item that I don't think anyone has ever talked about on the internet. And then the rest of my Soft Machine collection are, of course, there's tons and tons and tons of live material that came out. This is one of the, I think, better ones, in my opinion, is from the Soft Machine 2 period, Live at the Paradiso. It's the Ratledge, Wyatt, and Hopper. So it's all Soft Machine Volume 2 period right there. This one called Noisette, which is the... it's between 2 and 3, but it's... some of the recordings that this band did live went on to be used for the third album. So this is the 5-piece band of Ratledge, Hopper, Wyatt, plus Elton Dean and Lynn Dobson. So basically, a 5-piece was saved from the infamous 7-piece band in late '69 to make this. And then I have a 2 CD set here, Soft Machine in France. And this is the version, this is about the time of Volume 5. So this has John Marshall, and it has Elton Dean. So it's basically like the same version as Side 2 of Volume 5. Whoa, so that's about all the vinyl and CDs I'll be showing you here. But what I wanted to... what I was getting into talking about before I interrupted to talk about that is that this is now, as I start to get into the mid-'80s, all of this period from the early 80s to the mid-'80s, as I was disappointed with what was coming out in pop and rock, I was listening to all this Canterbury stuff, this strange stuff to everyone. That was like, what are you listening to, Glenn? Oh, did you hear Hatfield in the North? Or what are you talking about? Gong, Hatfield in the North, Soft Machine, all this old stuff that came out. How come you're not into, Duran Duran and Culture Club and all? I mean, I listen to what's on the radio, but that is not the stuff that was driving my, sensibilities and ambitions to want to be a musician. It was this stuff. So... mostly through all of this Canterbury music, although this style isn't the style that I would become. It's more like listening to all this stuff was inspiring me to want to do music, and then by the time the years 84 and 85, etc. came along, I was at Rutgers as a student. I was getting into music, into meeting musicians, getting into a band, getting into another band, sharing our information about the musicians we loved. And some of them even knew about the Canterbury music I was listening to. That was the motivating factor. I felt like I was entering a world of exclusivity, of music I know about, music that, that my musical associates know about, and we're getting into music, and maybe this will lead to something one day. But again, as far as what my playing style would end up being like, I have much more of a closer to a generic classic rock style of playing. Although I did for a few years try doing prog with a band in upstate New York. We were doing lots of rehearsals. We had lots of songs down, like In the Dead of Night by UK, and we did lots of Yes, some Genesis, some ELP, some King Crimson. But we could never get this stuff out of the rehearsal rooms, even though we had some stuff down well, and if we had a good sound person, we could get it out there. But it doesn't work as easy in my experience trying to get that stuff together than it does just meeting musicians that want to do classic rock. That for me was a more conducive to getting me gigs and getting me active in the music scene, in any music scene, but at least something I'd find satisfying. Whew. So I hope that was a interesting talk, showing you some albums, talking vinyl and CDs, talking music that inspired me to become a musician, a classic rock keyboard player. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And subscribe if you want to hear about future episodes. And I think for the next one, we'll get back to, we'll get away from album talk and get back into the classic rock gigging matters of this channel called 12 Tone Warrior.